Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject that once determined who would live, who would perish, and who would be unceremoniously dunked in the village. Pond accused of witchcraft, so before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from now. Dim the lights. Maybe grab a snack and let's jump in. You wake up on a damp straw mattress that smells like a compost heap, having a very average morning by medieval standards, which means you are already under suspicion for sorcery. Simply because you managed to wake up at all your neighbor saw you yawn without making the sign of the cross, and is now whispering to the village priest that you probably made a pact with the devil. Your hair is messy, not messy in the fashionable, courtly love, poetry kind of way, but messy in the sense that 3 sparrows might be renting it, which of course is evidence of your ability to commune with animals, and clearly, animals do not talk to normal people, so you must be a witch. You go outside to fetch water from the well, wearing your only tunic, which is dyed a slightly odd shade of green, not because you are trying to be mysterious, but because you spilled leek soup on it last week. But in this particular century, anything green that is not a tree or mold is the color of envy, and envy is the work of Satan. So congratulations, you are now a suspect. You try to smile politely at a passing goat herder, but unfortunately, your smile reveals that you have all of your teeth, which in the Middle Ages is basically proof that you have bargained with dark forces. Because no one over the age of 25 is supposed to have more than half a set before the next church bell. You sneeze once and fail to say, "God bless me," under your breath. So now you are obviously in league with demons and possibly plotting to ruin the harvest. Let me know in the comments if you think the medieval legal system might have been just a tiny bit biased, or if you too have ever been accused of cursing the weather without meaning to. Speaking of weather, you have noticed that the sky looks a bit stormy, and the village knows exactly who to blame for that hint. It's you and your suspicious habit of knowing when clouds mean rain. You carry on with your day, hoping to avoid eye contact, but the baker is already glaring because last week you told him his bread was burnt, and in this era having the ability to observe reality accurately is considered supernatural powers, which frankly might be the most accurate thing they ever accused anyone of. Now that you've survived the morning, let's move on to what happens after lunch. When someone sees you picking herbs for soup, which obviously means you are making a potion to hex the livestock, you stand in the meadow, holding a bunch of perfectly innocent parsley, which, in the 21st century, would make you a responsible home cook, but here in the Middle Ages, it is the botanical equivalent of a loaded crossbow pointed at the local cows. So as soon as old widow Marjorie sees you bending over to pick another sprig, she limps off as fast as her gout allows to alert the bailiff that you are concocting a curse. You try to explain that you are making soup because frankly, if you had any real magic, you would have summoned a decent lunch out of thin air by now. But explaining logic to medieval gossip is like trying to tell a cat not to knock over a cup of water. It will stare at you with wide eyes, and then do it anyway. So now the bailiff shows up with that smug look he reserves for catching someone red-handed. Except in this case, the red is from beet juice, because you were also gathering root vegetables, and this somehow becomes additional evidence that you are draining the life force from innocent plants. The bailiff confiscates your herbs, muttering something about sending them to the priest for testing, which, in practice, means they will be burned, while he pockets the more fragrant ones for his dinner stew. You head back toward your hut, trying to keep a low profile, but the local children have decided to follow you, chanting little rhymes about your cat, which is actually just a slightly overweight tabby that enjoys sleeping on your laundry. But in the imagination of the village, it is clearly a demon, familiar scent to spy on the pious townsfolk. The cat yawns, which is somehow interpreted as an unholy blessing, and one boy swears he saw its eyes glow red at dusk, probably because he was staring into the sunset too long before you can shoo them away. A merchant passing through stops his cart to get a better look at you. He asks if it is true you once walked home from the next village without getting lost, which in this century makes you some sort of supernatural navigator, because obviously normal people should wander in circles until they collapse from hunger and exposure. You think about telling him you simply followed the road, but decide against it because by now you understand that in this time and place, the shortest path to the stake is through rational conversation. So you give him a vague smile and keep walking, only to be stopped by the miller, who complains that last night the windmill stopped turning for a whole hour, and clearly this is your doing, since you live slightly uphill and might have stolen the wind for your own mysterious purposes. Never mind that you were asleep at the time and that wind patterns have nothing to do with your personal grudges. Before you can defend yourself, he warns you that his cousin in the next town over was accused of bewitching a windmill and ended up being thrown into the river to see if she would float, which apparently proves guilt if she does and innocence if she sinks and drowns. You make a mental note that in the Middle Ages, proving your innocence often involved a level of personal inconvenience up to and including death by drowning. By the time you finally reach your doorway, you find 2 chickens waiting there, which might seem harmless, except they do not belong to you, and in this paranoid climate, any unsolicited poultry is assumed to be a bribe from Satan himself. You shoo them away and step inside. But of course, one of your neighbors sees you doing this, and rushes to tell the priest that you have been in deep conference with the devil in bird form. Before you even have a chance to put down your basket, there is a knock at the door. It is the reeve who tells you there have been complaints about your tendency to hum while you work, because in a world where music is supposed to be strictly church approved, any melody not heard in Sunday service is immediately suspect. You try to explain it is just something you do to pass the time while mending your socks, but he points out that the last time you were heard humming was on the morning a traveling friar tripped over his own robes, which in the eyes of the village is clearly your fault. At this point, you start to wonder if perhaps you should lean into the witch persona just to make all the suspicion worthwhile. Perhaps you could charge a fee for predicting when bread will burn or when sheep will wander off, but you know that any profit made from such talents would only be further proof of your alliance with dark forces. So instead, you sit down at your table, light the small tallow candle and stare at the flickering flame, wondering if even the act of lighting it is suspicious. Because somewhere in this village, there is probably a man convinced that controlling fire is an unnatural skill. The candle sputters, and you briefly consider blowing it out, but that too could be misinterpreted as summoning darkness on purpose, and besides, you still need to finish your soup, which is by now half cold. So you pick up your wooden spoon and take a sip, and immediately regret it, because the parsley has gone bitter, and you know without a doubt that tomorrow someone will accuse you of intentionally ruining your own meal as part of some arcane ritual to curse the entire harvest. You sit staring at the bowl of bitter soup, knowing full well that every sip you take will somehow become further evidence against you, so you push it aside and decide to step outside for some fresh air, except of course, fresh air in the Middle Ages is a complicated concept. It smells like damp hay, wet dog smoke from 20 different hearths, and something vaguely medicinal, which might just be the apothecary trying to fumigate his shop after the last batch of leeches escaped. You take a few steps toward the common green and immediately notice a small gathering of villagers looking at you with that mix of fear and curiosity usually reserved for comets and unexplained cheese shortages. One of them points out that you are walking without a cloak, even though the wind is chilly, which clearly means you have an unnatural resistance to cold brought about by sinister. Means you want to explain that you simply forgot to mend the hole in your cloak and are too stubborn to wear it half falling off. But you know by now that common sense is the rarest herb of all in this village, so you say nothing and keep walking. The blacksmith's wife hurries up to tell you that her hens have stopped laying eggs and asks if you have been speaking ill of them, which apparently can curse poultry productivity. You assure her that you have never once insulted her chickens, but then you remember you did once comment that they looked rather scrawny, and that probably counts as malicious speech in a world where barnyard politics are as serious as royal affairs. Before you can escape, she presses a tiny loaf of rye bread into your hands and whispers that if you bless it, her hens might start laying again. Which is awkward because blessing bread is a priest thing, and doing it without his permission is basically forging divine paperwork. You take the loaf anyway, hoping to avoid offense, but this is immediately spotted by the tanner, who decides you are obviously conducting some secret barter arrangement involving bread and curses. The tanner then announces loudly that he saw you once walk through the churchyard at dusk, which in his mind is when spirits are most active, and therefore you were clearly there to recruit them as part of your personal haunting committee. You think about reminding him that the churchyard is literally the fastest route to your hut, but again, logic is a foreign language here. So you just nod and continue past the well, where two washerwomen are scrubbing linens. They pause mid-scrub to glare at you. One mutters that her left knee has been aching since you looked at her last Tuesday, and that is absolutely the kind of physical symptom only a witch could cause, because apparently medieval joint pain is never related to age or hard labor. The other washerwoman says she heard from her cousin that your shadow once fell on a barrel of cider, which then went sour. This is true in the sense that it happened, but only because the cider was already fermenting poorly, and yet here you are, another data point in their ever-growing ledger of suspicious deeds. You retreat toward the edge of the green, thinking maybe you could disappear into the woods for a while, but the shepherd intercepts you with a tale about how 3 of his lambs wandered off last week and were later found near your hut. You know this is because lambs are curious and grass grows near your hut, but in his telling it is because you lured them there to practice dark arts, which is an impressive accusation given that you have no idea what one is supposed to do with a bewitched lamb unless the goal is to knit a particularly judgmental sweater. The shepherd warns you to stay away from his flock, which is ironic because you have been actively avoiding anything with wool ever since your tunic started shedding lint like a molting goose. You finally reach the small footbridge over the stream, thinking you might at least enjoy the sound of water, but here you are met by the miller's wife, who claims her dream last night featured you standing by this very bridge holding a fish, and that dreams are always true omens. She cannot quite explain what the fish means, but she is certain it is bad news for the village, perhaps famine, or maybe the fish was the devil in disguise. Either way, it is definitely your fault. You step onto the bridge anyway, because at this point, being accused of dream crimes feels almost like a vacation from regular accusations. The water below gurgles past, carrying bits of leaves and the occasional unfortunate insect, and you briefly imagine what it would be like to just follow the stream until you found a town where people only suspected you of normal things, like stealing vegetables or owing money, but your fantasy is interrupted by the local pig keeper who has appeared on the far side of the bridge with news that one of his sows gave birth to a piglet with a slightly crooked tail, and obviously this is the sort of deformity caused by your evil gaze. You do not remember ever looking at his pigs, but apparently the curse works retroactively. The pig keeper insists you come look at the animal so you can see what you have done, but you politely decline because the last thing you need is to be caught standing over a strangely shaped pig in front of a crowd. By now you can hear church bells in the distance, which means evening prayers are about to start, and you realize that skipping them would be taken as further proof of your alliance with unholy forces, so you turn toward the church, thinking perhaps attendance will help your case. Inside the church is dim and smells of wax smoke and damp stone. You slide into a pew hoping to blend in, but the priest pauses mid-homily to glance at you in a way that suggests he is already drafting next Sunday's sermon on the dangers of harboring witches in godly communities. You sit very still in the pew while the priest continues speaking, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls in that way that makes every word feel like it is being carved into the air by a particularly judgmental chisel. You try to focus on the sermon about humility and obedience, but every few sentences his gaze flicks toward you as if he is waiting for you to burst into flames, or at least sneeze in Latin. The congregation shifts in their seats, some leaning subtly away from you as though witchcraft is contagious and can be caught. Like a cough, you fold your hands in your lap and make the mistake of closing your eyes for a moment, which apparently is enough for the old woman behind you to decide you have fallen into a trance, communing with dark spirits. She pokes you sharply in the back with her walking stick to break the spell, which only makes you jump and nearly drop the small prayer book someone lent you. The book lands on the floor with a thud loud enough to make the priest pause again, and this time he just stares at you in silence until you awkwardly retrieve it and try to sink lower into the pew. After the service ends, you make for the door as quickly as dignity will allow, but are intercepted by the reeve, who informs you that there will be a special meeting in the tavern tonight to discuss recent strange happenings, and although he does not say it outright, his expression makes it clear that you are both the guest of honor and the main course. You consider not going, but you know that absence will be seen as guilt, so you trudge toward the tavern. Later that evening, the air smells of spilled ale, damp wool, and the kind of unwashed humanity that has no idea soap exists. The tavern is packed with villagers, all pretending to be very interested in their mugs, but you can feel their eyes tracking you the way cats watch a suspiciously twitching curtain. The reeve clears his throat and starts listing recent incidents from sour cider to crooked-tailed piglets, all of which are somehow linked to you. The baker speaks up about his burned bread, again as if carbonized crust is a mark of the devil. The miller recounts the hour his windmill stopped spinning, and adds new details about seeing a shadowy figure near the stream, which you suspect is complete invention, but no one seems to care. Then the shepherd raises his hand to accuse you of looking at the sky in a manner that predicted rain, which he claims ruined a sheep shearing day. You open your mouth to point out that the clouds were doing most of the predicting, but the moment you speak, the room goes very still. The priest steps forward holding a small leather pouch which he says contains holy salt. He proposes a test where they sprinkle it around your home to see if it reacts in any unusual way, which is both vague and ominous, because you have no idea what counts as unusual in their minds. Perhaps if it clumps, they will say the devil's breath made it damp. Perhaps if it stays loose, they will say you enchanted it to resist divine influence. You realize there is no version of this test you can win. The tavern keeper brings over a mug of something meant to be ale and slides it toward you in what might be an act of pity or just curiosity to see if you drink it without bursting into smoke. You take a sip and it tastes faintly of rust, which you suspect is not part of any holy test, but may still be judged as suspicious. The reeve announces that the salt sprinkling will take place at dawn, so everyone can see for themselves. You walk home in the dark, passing groups of whispering neighbors who pretend not to notice you, though one child calls out asking if you can turn him into a frog because his sister would find it funny. You give him a look that makes him laugh nervously and run back inside his house. By the time you reach your door, you are too tired to even make soup, so you sit by the fire, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall, wondering if tomorrow will be the day. They decide to turn suspicion into action. You think briefly about running away in the night, but remember that fleeing will only confirm their belief in your guilt, so instead, you wrap yourself in a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and sheep, and try to sleep, knowing that at first light, the village will be tramping through your doorway with a pouch of salt and an appetite for drama. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because there is already the muffled sound of feet crunching on frost outside your hut, which means the village has decided to show up early for the holy salt inspection, as though catching you in your sleep will reveal some terrible nocturnal truth. You sit up, pulling the blanket tight around your shoulders and glance at the door where a faint line of light leaks through the edges, and you can hear hushed voices, trying and failing to whisper. One of them says they wonder if your hut will smell like brimstone. Another says it smells like cabbage from here, and you silently congratulate yourself for the soup you made 3 days ago that has been stubbornly clinging to the air. The latch lifts without a knock, and in comes the Reeve holding the little leather pouch like it is both a relic and a dangerous weapon. Behind him, the priest steps in, looking as if he has been awake all night rehearsing pious condemnation. The rest of the crowd clusters in the doorway, craning their necks to see the great spectacle of sprinkling white grains on a floor. The Reeve kneels on the packed dirt and unties the pouch, producing a handful of salt which he tosses gently onto the ground. In a little arc, it lands without drama, as salt tends to do, but everyone leans forward, waiting for something to happen. When nothing does, they murmur amongst themselves, and the priest declares that true evil hides from holy things, which somehow is also proof of guilt. They sprinkle more near your hearth, more near your bed, and then, for good measure, a line across your threshold. So if you step over it later, they can interpret that however they please. A child pipes up, asking if the salt can be licked to check its holiness, and before anyone can stop him, he does so, making a face and declaring it tastes like salt, which should have ended the matter, but instead, the priest nods gravely, as if this is important theological data. You stand there, arms crossed, watching as they shuffle about your home, poking at things as though expecting to find a cauldron bubbling with curses. They open your cupboard and find dried beans, which are promptly described as suspicious because they are black, and everyone knows black is the color of night, and night is the playground of the devil. Someone points to your cat, now curled up on your only chair, and asks if it has ever spoken. To you, you reply that it has not, unless meowing counts, which earns a gasp from two women in the back, who are now convinced the animal confesses its crimes daily. They finally step outside to sprinkle a protective ring of salt around the hut so the evil within cannot escape, which raises the awkward question of whether you are now expected to live here forever, like some cursed museum exhibit. You follow them out into the cold morning air, which smells faintly of wood smoke and manure, and the Reeve announces that the test is complete, but that the results will need to be discussed at length, which of course means another meeting in the tavern. You are tempted to ask if they might just move you into the tavern permanently to save everyone the trouble, but you hold your tongue. Instead, you walk to the stream to fetch water because, regardless of accusations, life insists on continuing. The water is icy enough to sting your fingers, and you think that if the villagers truly believed you had supernatural powers, they would at least assume you could summon warm water and save yourself the discomfort on the way back. You pass the blacksmith, who nods curtly and then mentions in a voice loud enough for nearby ears that the sound of his hammering seemed strangely muffled yesterday, which could mean you have cast a dampening spell on his forge to weaken the tools of honest men. You keep walking because, at this point, even blinking too quickly could be recast as a curse. The midday sun never truly breaks through the low grey clouds, and by the time you return home with the water, you see that the salt ring around your hut has already been partially disturbed by a pair of wandering chickens, one of which is enthusiastically pecking at the grains. You can already imagine the priest declaring that the birds have been possessed to sabotage holy protections, and that somehow this is your doing. You step inside and close the door, knowing it will not keep the gossip out. The village has a way of seeping through the walls without ever opening them. You sit down at your table and begin preparing another pot of soup, because even witches apparently have to eat. And as the fire catches you, wonder whether the smell of boiling cabbage will later be interpreted as the scent of forbidden alchemy. By the time the soup is simmering, the sound of footsteps approaches again, which is never a good sign in a village where footsteps almost always bring either gossip or accusations. You open the door to find the Reeve standing there with the kind of smile that is both polite and vaguely predatory. He informs you that the tavern meeting to discuss the holy salt results will begin sooner than expected, because the priest believes delaying will give evil a chance to regroup. You consider pointing out that evil seems to be doing just fine without rest breaks, but decide it is wiser to simply nod and follow him as you walk through the village. You can feel eyes peering from behind shutters, and hear the occasional muttered comment about how your hair looks suspiciously tidy for someone accused of witchcraft, which in this logic means you must have bewitched your comb. You arrive at the tavern and are greeted by the smell of stale ale, damp wool, and a faint whiff of boiled onions that might be coming from a pot in the corner or from one of the patrons. The room is crowded. The priest stands near the fireplace, holding a small scrap of parchment, which, he claims, contains notes from the inspection, though you suspect it is blank. For dramatic effect, he begins by announcing that while the salt did not react visibly, this is in itself suspicious, because true evil is cunning enough to hide from holy substances. The crowd murmurs in agreement, as though this makes perfect sense. The baker suggests another test involving floating you in the mill pond to see if you sink or swim. The shepherd adds that you should also be made to hold a hot iron to prove your innocence, which in his mind is a merciful test, because the burns would heal quickly if you were truly innocent. The miller chimes in with a story he heard from his cousin about a woman in the next town who was accused after her cow gave milk on a Sunday, which apparently is unnatural unless blessed by a priest. You stand there absorbing all this and wonder if perhaps the true miracle is that anyone survives a day without being accused of something. The tavern keeper refills mugs and passes them around, which only adds to the rising energy in the room, as ale tends to do. Soon the conversation drifts toward what punishment might be fitting should guilt be confirmed. The suggestions range from banishment to public shaming, to having you sit in the stocks with a sign reading consorter with demons, which you think might actually be good for business. If you charged people to have their fortunes told, the priest eventually raises his hands for silence and proposes a compromise. You will be given one final test at dawn tomorrow in the church itself, a trial by candlelight, where you will be made to walk between rows of lit candles without disturbing the flames. If any candle flickers, it will be taken as proof that the devil walks with you. The crowd reacts with a mix of approval and disappointment. Those who wanted a more theatrical punishment will have to wait. You are told to return home and prepare yourself, which is amusing because you are not sure how one prepares for walking near candles without breathing the wrong way on them as you step back into the cold night. Ere the stars are faint behind drifting clouds, and the village is quiet in that expectant way that makes you feel like prey. In a field just before the fox appears, you make your way home, passing the stream where the moonlight glints on the water, and you think briefly about how easy it would be to keep walking into the woods and never return, but you know that in a week, someone would claim they saw your ghost hovering over the village green, and the accusations would only grow. You reach your hut and find the salt ring now covered in frost, giving it an oddly pretty sparkle that does nothing to improve its alleged holy properties. You stoke the fire, eat a small bowl of soup, and wrap yourself in your blanket, wondering how still you will have to stand tomorrow to keep every candle from betraying you in a world where even the wind seems eager to assist. In your conviction, you wake to the muffled toll of the church bell in the pre-dawn gloom, and the realization that today is the day of the trial by candlelight, which is not exactly the sort of event one circles on the calendar with excitement. The air inside your hut is heavy with the smell of last night's fire mixed with cabbage and faintly singed wool from the blanket you slept under. You step outside into the brittle cold, your breath puffing in little clouds, and see the reeve already waiting, his expression somewhere between triumph and the self-importance of a man who has been handed a sacred duty. Even if that duty is mostly about herding you toward the inevitable, you follow him through the silent streets, past shuttered windows, where you can feel unseen eyes tracking you the way a cat follows a dangling string. The church looms ahead, its steeple just a dark wedge against the paling sky, and as you step inside, the smell of beeswax and damp stone closes around you. The interior is dim, except for the neat double row of candles stretching from the heavy wooden doors to the altar, their flames dancing gently in the draught. Like nervous gossipers, the priest stands at the far end, hands clasped in solemn expectation, and behind you the door creaks as villagers file in to take seats along the walls, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Someone coughs, and the sound ricochets off the walls like a misplaced drumbeat. The priest explains in the tone of a man narrating divine theater that you will walk between the candles slowly, and any flicker that is not caused by obvious movement of air will be taken as proof that unholy forces walk with you. You nod, because there is nothing else to do, and step forward. The first few paces are uneventful, though you are acutely aware of every muscle in your body holding its position, as though even blinking could cause a breeze. The flames sway gently but steadily until a draft snakes in from the high narrow windows, causing one candle to gutter. Alarmingly, you freeze mid-step, and the priest narrows his eyes, then declares that the draft is permissible, but warns you that the devil is cunning and may seek to disguise his influence as mere wind. You resume walking, passing candle after candle, each one an unblinking witness to your concentration. The murmurs from the crowd rise and fall, like the tide, punctuated by the occasional gasp when a wick pops or a flame bends sideways. Near the halfway point, a particularly tall candle leans slightly toward you, and a woman in the front row clutches her neighbor's sleeve, whispering that it is reaching for you, as if drawn by some invisible tether. The priest clears his throat and motions you on. You reach the final few candles, and your shoulders ache from holding so still when, without warning, one flame sputters violently and goes out entirely. You hear a collective intake of breath, and the air thickens with the certainty of your guilt. You glance at the extinguished candle and see that its wick was half drowned in melted wax. But you know any explanation will sound like the devil whispering in your ear. The priest raises his voice, declaring that the trial is complete and the sign is clear, though he adds that, out of fairness, you will be allowed to speak before the council at sunset, which is his way of saying the village has an entire day to work itself into a frenzy. You are escorted out into the thin winter light, and the people trail after you like a procession of vultures, too polite to start picking until the official signal. You walk back to your hut with the sense that the salt ring is now more decorative than protective. The frost still clings to it, sparkling like an ironic halo. You go inside, stoke the fire, and stare into the flames, wondering if perhaps it would be better to lean into their story entirely, to claim the title of witch, and demand payment for every predicted storm and every batch of sour cider. After all, if you are to be burned for the part, you might as well give them a show worth the price of admission by the time the sun begins to sink in a bruised smear across the winter sky. You have already spent several hours debating whether it is better to appear calm, confident, or slightly unhinged when the council meets. Because each approach has its merits. Calm makes you look saintly, confident makes you look untouchable, and unhinged makes you look unpredictable, which in theory might discourage them from lighting you on fire in practice. However, you suspect nothing you do will change the outcome. Since most of the council members decided your fate, somewhere between the extinguished candle and their midday ale, you step outside and the cold bites instantly at your face. The village square is filling with bodies, their breath hanging in the air in soft white plumes. The council table has been dragged into the center and it is surrounded by benches that look like they were designed to be uncomfortable on purpose. Perhaps as a subtle way of reminding everyone that justice requires endurance. The council consists of the reeve, the priest, the miller, the blacksmith, and widow Marjorie, who has been on the council longer than most of the village roofs have been standing, and who can silence an entire crowd with the arch of an eyebrow. You are made to stand in the middle, your feet crunching on the frost hardened dirt, and the reeve begins the proceedings by clearing his throat in that grand manner people use when they believe their voice is about to be immortalized in song. He recounts the morning trial with the sort of embellishment usually reserved for heroic tales. There is mention of the candle that leaned toward you, the gasp from the crowd, and the lone flame that sputtered out at your very presence, as though the wax itself had recoiled in terror. When he finishes, the priest stands and adds that while divine judgment is often subtle, the Almighty is perfectly capable of sending hints for those willing to see them. He says this while looking directly at you, in the same way a cat looks at a mouse, just before deciding whether to bother pouncing. The blacksmith speaks next, but only to grumble that he has never liked your attitude toward authority, and that alone is reason enough to keep an eye on you. The miller says little but nods at all the wrong moments, including when widow Marjorie leans forward to ask you whether you have ever spoken to your bread before baking it, a question so bizarre that for a moment you wonder if she has confused you with her own kitchen habits. You answer honestly that no, you have never conversed with bread, though you once shouted at a particularly stubborn pot of porridge, and the crowd laughs. Uneasily, the council mutters among themselves, and then widow Marjorie raises a hand for silence. She announces that in her opinion, you should be given one final chance to prove your innocence by spending the night in the church with every candle lit, and if not a single one goes out by dawn, then you will be cleared. The crowd murmurs approval because it sounds both merciful and entertaining. The priest agrees but insists that the doors be locked from the outside to prevent any trickery, and that several villagers remain as witnesses. The arrangement is made quickly because nothing galvanizes a medieval village quite like the prospect of a night-long vigil involving possible witchcraft. You are escorted to the church as the last light drains from the sky, and when the doors close behind you, the sudden quiet is almost tangible. The rows of candles throw flickering shadows across the stone walls, and the air smells of melted wax and cold stone. Your assigned watchers sit near the door, huddled in cloaks, their eyes fixed on you as if expecting you to sprout horns at any moment. You choose a spot near the altar, Partly for warmth, partly because if divine intervention is going to arrive, it might as well have a short walk. You sit cross-legged and watch the flames dance, each one steady for now, though you can already feel the draft from the high windows sliding down like a ghost with chilly fingers. Time stretches, and you begin to think about how strange it is that so much of your life now hinges on the behavior of fire. You picture the morning when the doors will open and the villagers will crowd in their faces, eager to read your fate in the quiet language of wax and flame, and you wonder whether you should hope for dawn or for something far stranger. The first hour passes without incident, unless you count the blacksmith's apprentice snoring in the corner, which the priest pretends not to hear, and the candles hold their flames with a stubborn steadiness, as though determined to spite the gossip of the village. You spend the time cataloguing the irregularities of the stone floor around the altar, noting that one slab is distinctly warmer than the others, and wondering whether this is due to some ancient burial beneath, or merely an overachieving pocket of residual sunlight from the day. The watchers whisper among themselves, mostly about who will get to eat the leftover bread from the evening meal, and you suspect that if you do survive this ordeal, it will be thanks less to divine mercy than to the fact that no one wants to interrupt their supper by burning you alive. The second hour drags in that peculiar way time does when you are waiting for disaster, your mind flitting between optimism and dread. One moment imagining yourself walking free into the frosty dawn, and the next picturing the Reeve smiling smugly as he oversees the gathering of firewood outside the church. The flames continue to flicker but not falter until a faint shift of air snakes through the nave, and the smallest candle nearest the door bends its flame almost flat before righting itself. You notice the priest watching it too, and for a moment you both pretend you did not see what you just saw. By the third hour, the air grows colder, and you begin to wonder whether the church itself is breathing, each draft rolling in and out with a rhythm that does not match the wind outside. And then you hear it, faint at first, a sound like fabric dragging over stone. It seems to come from behind the altar, though when you glance that way, nothing has changed, save for the shadows which appear just slightly longer than before. The fourth hour brings with it a creeping drowsiness, one you fight off by counting the exact number of cracks in the nearest wall and deciding which ones most resembled the profile of the Reeve. During an especially boring sermon, the watchers shift in their seats, occasionally mumbling about the cold and pulling their cloaks tighter. Then, just as you reach the end of your crack, counting the candle nearest your left hand sputters hard enough to spray a fleck of hot wax onto your wrist. You flinch, and the priest rises, but before he can take more than 2 steps, the flame regains its composure, as though embarrassed by its moment of weakness. He mutters a prayer and returns to his place. You think you see Widow Marjorie's nephew smirk in the shadows of the doorway, where he has slipped in to gawk at the accused. The fifth hour is when things become stranger still. The sound of fabric returns, only louder, and this time it is joined by the unmistakable creak of wood, a slow, deliberate complaint from the beams high above you. Tilt your head and catch movement in the rafters. Not a person exactly, but something darker than the surrounding dark. A shifting knot of shadow that slides along the ceiling and disappears behind one of the carved saints. You say nothing, partly because you suspect no one will believe you, and partly because you are not entirely sure it was not simply a trick of the candlelight. The sixth hour arrives, and you are now acutely aware of every heartbeat, every shuffle, every inhale of your fellow captives. In this vigil, the air smells faintly of iron now, as though someone has been sharpening blades in a distant corner of the church. The seventh hour brings a change. In the watchers, one of them, a young shepherd, stands and announces he will not sit another moment in the company of someone who can make Shadows crawl, his words slur slightly, and you realize he has fortified himself with more than just faith before. Entering this place, the priest tries to quiet him, but he storms out, leaving the door ajar long enough for a gust of wind to ripple through the nave, sending every candle dancing at once. Several nearly gutter out, and your heart lurches as the villagers lunge forward to shield them with cupped hands. The 8th hour passes in brittle silence, broken only by the occasional cough or shift of weight. Then the 9th hour crawls in, bringing with it an uneasy sense that the night is both watching you and growing impatient. The shadows no longer seem fixed. They inch forward in subtle pulses, as though the walls themselves are leaning closer to hear your thoughts. By the 10th hour, you have stopped feeling cold entirely, and that is somehow worse. The warmth has a thick, almost oily quality to it, like the air before a thunderstorm, though you know no storm could be coming in this frozen season. The priest mutters again and again that dawn is near, but when you glance toward the high windows, the blackness outside remains absolute. You begin to suspect that time itself has been tampered with, that the hours might be looping in on themselves, trapping you in this flickering cage for as long as it amuses whatever is lurking unseen. The 11th hour drips forward one breath at a time, the wax pooling thick at the base of each candle, and the flames beginning to burn lower, not from wind, but from simple exhaustion, and you wonder if perhaps that is the true test, not whether the candles go out, but whether you do. And as the 12th hour looms, you find yourself staring into the heart of the largest flame, seeing shapes move there that have no business existing, in fire shapes that look suspiciously like faces, watching, waiting, smiling, and you cannot decide if those faces are formed of molten light, or if they are simply borrowing the fire for a while, the way a stranger might sit in a chair you left briefly unattended. And it does not help that their smiles seem to widen each time you blink, as though they are taking advantage of the momentary darkness behind your eyelids to rearrange themselves into something closer to recognition. The murmurs around you have dwindled to nothing now. Even the priest has stopped muttering his endless reassurance about the coming dawn and stands instead with his lips slightly parted, his eyes fixed on the same flame that holds you captive. And you realize that no one here is breathing as regularly as they should, that each inhale is shallow, each exhale reluctant, as though the air has taken on weight and must be moved with effort. The faces in the flame seem to lean forward, and you feel a ridiculous urge to lean in too, because despite every sensible thought in your head, there is something inviting about the glow, as if stepping into it would be less an act of burning and more like being welcomed into a room you had been circling for years without the courage to enter. Somewhere in the rafters there is a faint creak, followed by the softest patter, like grains of sand falling in slow rhythm. But no one looks up, perhaps because none of you want to know what could be waiting above that has been content to watch all this time. The 12th hour is supposed to bring release, or at least the illusion of it yet. Here it arrives without fanfare, no rush of pale light through the windows, no distant rooster calling, only the same black weight pressing against the glass, and you cannot shake the certainty that the night is aware of your expectations and has chosen not to fulfill them out of some petty satisfaction. Instead, the candles bow lower, the flames elongating into narrow, trembling threads, and you notice with an unpleasant twist in your stomach that the wax is not simply pooling on the stone floor, but is creeping outward in slow, deliberate paths, like pale fingers stretching toward your boots. You step back, or try to, but find that your body is reluctant to obey, as if something in the air is holding you in place. And it is then you realize that the others are not moving, either, their eyes wide, unblinking, their faces slack, not in fear, but in a sort of suspended anticipation. The flame faces are clearer now, you can count them 5, no 6, each with the same infuriating half-smile and the same eyes that seem to widen and narrow in time with your heartbeat, and just as you think you might be able to turn away, one of them tilts its head in the smallest, most deliberate motion, and the sensation that follows is not one of being seen but of being recognized, as if whatever these shapes are, they have known you far longer than you have known them. The wax fingers brush against your boots, now cool and strangely dry, despite being liquid seconds ago. And in that contact there is the faintest pull, like a child tugging at your sleeve, and you find yourself wondering what would happen if you allowed it to guide you. Somewhere in the corner of your vision, the high windows ripple, not with light, but with a shifting of the darkness itself, as if the night has decided to move closer, to press its face against the glass, to watch more intently, and a thought blooms, uninvited, that perhaps the reason dawn has not come is because it is no longer outside to bring in, but rather it has been drawn here, into the room, into the candles, into the wax, into you. The thought that dawn might already be inside the room sits in your mind like an unwelcome guest who has no intention of leaving, and once it settles there, it begins to unpack little observations you had been ignoring all night, such as the way the shadows on the walls have been getting brighter rather than darker, as though the light is no longer something that arrives from the outside, but something that leaks slowly from within. And you start to suspect that maybe the sun has grown tired of the whole horizon routine and decided to take a more personal interest in what you are doing here, which would be flattering if it did not come with the faint smell of scorched fabric from somewhere. In the circle, perhaps your own sleeve, the faces in the flames have begun to lose their neat edges, as if they are melting along with the wax, and in their place is something harder to define, less face and more suggestion of a face, like the memory of someone you met in passing years ago but cannot place the name of, and every time you think you have almost remembered, the wax creeps another inch up your boots, making a sound not unlike paper tearing slowly in the next breath. You notice the air has changed again, not warmer, not cooler, just different, as if the room has inhaled and is now holding its breath, waiting for you to do the same. The villagers still stand motionless, but you begin to see tiny movements in their eyes, little flicks toward the flames, toward you, toward the high windows, where the darkness now looks almost translucent, as though something enormous is pressing its shape against the other side and testing the strength of the glass. The priest finally moves, but only to tilt his head upward in the slow, deliberate way someone might tilt a cup to see if there is any water left, and you follow his gaze, expecting to see the rafters again, but instead you see nothing at all, no beams, no ceiling, just an unbroken stretch of pale color that might be sky if sky had ever looked this close, and this indifferent. A faint hum builds somewhere deep in your ears, though it feels less like sound and more like the vibration of a thought that is not yours, and it is accompanied by the quiet certainty that whatever has been waiting all these hours is no longer waiting. The wax has reached your knees now, and you are surprised to find that it does not burn or even chill, it simply holds you with the kind of grip that assumes you will not resist, and perhaps you will not, because somewhere in the bright blur above you there is movement, shapes gliding in the pale expanse, with the lazy confidence of predators that have never had to chase anything, and one of them tilts its head exactly the way the flame face did earlier, and the hum in your skull sharpens into something very close to a word, but not one your mouth could form, even if you wanted to, and then the glass in the windows begins to bow inward, not shattering, not cracking, just bending, as though the weight outside has decided to press through, without breaking form, and the villagers finally blink in unison, as if on some unspoken signal, and it strikes You that they have not been trapped like you, they have been part of this from the start. The wax surges higher, the pale expanse lowers, the hum becomes a pulse, and you realize that whatever passes for morning here is about to arrive, whether you are ready to greet it or not. The moment it touches you, there is no blinding flash, no cinematic roar, no heralding chorus of cosmic trumpets. Instead, it is the quietest thing you have ever felt, the kind of quiet that makes your own pulse sound indecently loud, and you realize, with the slow dismay of a person reading the last page of a book they did not know they were almost finished, that this quiet is not the absence of sound, but the replacement of it, a new medium, thick and soft, settling into your ears like warm dust. The pale expanse is no longer above you but around you, and the windows, the walls, the floor have all politely excused themselves from existence. The villagers are here too, though it takes a moment to recognize them without their edges. They are blurring gently like ink in water, each shape sliding in and out of itself, until you can no longer be certain which outline belonged to which face, or if they ever had faces at all. The wax is gone, or maybe it is still here but invisible, dissolved into whatever substance now holds you in place, and the hum that had been pulsing in your head is gone, replaced by something that is somehow both colder and more intimate. A kind of noticing, like the attention of a cat deciding whether your lap is worth claiming. You think of asking what this is, or where you are, or even why, but every time the thought rises, it is quietly dismantled before reaching the surface, as if the act of questioning would be considered poor manners here instead. You stand or float or simply remain, while the shapes that used to be villagers drift nearer, their movements deliberate but unhurried, like they are conducting a tour of something very old and very proud. And then you see it, not in front of you, not behind you, not in any direction that would make sense in the old geometry of rooms and streets, but in all directions at once, a vast structure made of nothing you can name, and yet every part of it feels faintly familiar, like pieces of every roof beam, candle stub, and whispered prayer you have ever known, fused into an architecture that breathes. The shapes guide you toward it, or maybe the structure draws you in on its own, and as you near it, you notice what you thought was stillness is not stillness at all. The surface moves in subtle ripples, each one forming and unforming images, faces, places, events, some you recognize, some you are sure have not yet happened, but all flicker away before you can fix them in memory. The pale expanse tightens its hold, or perhaps loosens, depending on whether you believe you are being welcomed or restrained, and a sensation, like a fingertip tracing the inside of your skull, begins to pull forward a memory you are not sure belongs to you. It is of another night, another circle of people, another set of candles that are somehow the same candles you left behind, and the hum returns not in your ears this time but directly behind your eyes, and it resolves again into that almost word that you cannot pronounce, and yet this time you understand it enough to know it is not a name or a command but a statement, and the statement is that there has never been a dawn and there will never be one, not here, not in the way you meant it. And as the shapes close the last space between you and the structure, you feel yourself begin to stretch thin, not in pain, not in fear, but in the slow, certain way that wax stretches before it drips, and you understand without needing to be told that you will not be leaving this place in any form that would fit back into the idea of a body, but you will be part of it, part of the structure, part of the hum, part of the thing that waits for others to sit through the hours until the candles fail and the pale expanse comes to take them too. It is difficult to say exactly when you stopped being a person and started being a component, because the transition is neither announced nor ceremonially marked. It simply happens in the same unceremonious way the seasons turn, or milk goes sour. One day you are something with a name, and the next you are a filament woven into a lattice that does not bother with such particulars. The structure accepts you without approval or rejection, and you quickly learn that here acceptance is not an emotional state, but an architectural one. You are placed where you fit, which turns out to be everywhere and nowhere at once, and in this peculiar geography, you become aware of the other filaments, each of them carrying the faint aftertaste of a life they once held. Some hum with the rhythm of long-forgotten footsteps. Others shimmer faintly with the weight of countless unspoken thoughts, and some seem so faint you wonder if they ever lived at all, or if they are echoes from something even older than living. The pale expanse flows between all of you, not so much light as the suggestion of it washing through your threads in slow, deliberate waves. It is not communication exactly, but more like osmosis, a gradual sharing of images, sensations, memories that may or may not be yours, and you find yourself absorbing pieces of other existences without ever seeking them. A fisherman standing on a rocky coast centuries ago, waiting for a tide that will not turn. A girl carrying a jug down a path worn so thin it seems cut into the earth. A hand gripping a feather pen in the dim light of a window, while snow falls so quietly outside that it feels like a secret. Each of these scenes drifts through you and away again, leaving behind faint tracings like fingerprints in soft clay. The absence of a body is both liberating and disorienting, because you can no longer anchor yourself in hunger or breath or the sensation of standing still. The only measure of time here is the slow shifting of the lattice, as if it is adjusting itself to some vast and imperceptible tide, and with each shift, you notice more details in the expanse around you, faint currents that seem to pull from nowhere to nowhere, and shapes in the distance that are not part of the structure, but move with a kind of intent. They do not approach, and they do not retreat, they simply remain there. Like punctuation in a sentence you have not yet learned to read, and yet you feel their attention like a warm weight on the back of your mind. Sometimes one of them will tilt slightly as if listening, and in that moment the hum inside the structure deepens, its pitch enough for every filament to feel it pass through them, and in those moments you understand that the structure itself is aware, and that you are now part of its awareness. In the same way a pebble is part of a wall, and while you may not direct its will, you cannot help but sense that your presence, however small, is now woven into its purpose. What that purpose is remains unspoken and perhaps unspeakable, but you begin to suspect it has something to do with the long, slow gathering of threads like yours, until one day or night, or whatever the equivalent is here, the lattice will have reached some unmeasured completion, and then something will happen, something that is not a dawn and not an ending, but will be just as irreversible as the moment you first touched the pale expanse and slipped into its quiet. You begin to notice that the lattice is no longer entirely still. Between its patient adjustments there is now a subtle vibration, not unlike the low murmur of an argument happening in another room, one that you cannot quite make out, but you know somehow concerns you, not you personally, but you as part of the weave. It is a strange thing to feel the place you are part of behaving as though it is uncertain about itself. The hum moves through the threads in short, uneven pulses, and you find yourself drawn toward them, not physically, since that is no longer possible, but in the way a thought drifts back again and again, despite your best efforts to dismiss it. There is a sense of rehearsal in the air, as if the lattice is practicing something over and over without explaining why. At first you assume this is just how it has always been, but the other threads whisper differently. Their impressions trickle into you, wordless and faint, but unmistakable. The structure is preparing for a departure. No one can say where it will go, because here, the concept of where is an unhelpful leftover from the bodily world, but the preparation is real. You begin to sense long lines of tension, stretching through the expanse like drawn bowstrings, and in those tensions, you catch flashes of things outside the lattice, or maybe inside it, depending on how you choose to define inside and outside. You see fragments of places that are too detailed to be imagined, yet too impossible to have existed, a corridor carved into the ribs of something enormous that hums faintly with every shift of its bones, a plain where towers grow like plants curling toward a sun that is not there, a sea that reflects nothing at all. These visions do not stay, they slide away as soon as you notice them, as though they are shy and unwilling to be examined closely. You suspect that the lattice is not merely a place, but a vessel, and not in the poetic sense, in the literal way. A boat is a vessel, and you are not the passenger, but the whole part of the thing that will move when it moves, which means whatever lies ahead is not a destination you will arrive at, but an event you will become. As this thought takes shape, the vibration changes its tone. It is no longer uneven, but steady and deep enough that it feels like it could shake loose the last bits of who you used to be, and perhaps that is the point you remember in a vague, detached way, that vessels must be lightened before they travel far, and the weight you carry here is not measured in stone or metal, but in the stubborn clinging of old shapes, old names, old versions of yourself you have been holding without realizing it. You wonder if the structure knows that to shed these things might make you lighter, but will also make you less you, and then you realize the question is meaningless, because here, you is already a plural, and whatever is left will still be part of the weave, whether or not you remember who first entered it. The hum deepens again, and you feel the first true motion of the lattice, not a shift, not a tremor, but a glide, so slow and smooth you might have mistaken it for the idea of moving, if not for the way the expanse around you begins to bend, as though space itself is politely making room for something vast and patient to pass through. The glide continues so gently that, if you were not paying attention, you might convince yourself nothing is happening at all, except that the surroundings have begun to stretch in a way that feels both deliberate and entirely indifferent, as though the lattice is a long train passing through a station that never agreed to have a station in the first place. Threads near you twist slightly, as if aligning themselves to an unseen current, and the hum changes again, now carrying a faint metallic edge, like the sound of a wire vibrating somewhere far away. It is not unpleasant exactly, but it does feel like a reminder of something you should already know, though you cannot say what. Other strands seem restless, they are shifting their weight in the weave, which is strange because weight is not supposed to be a thing here. Yet you can feel it, the way you can feel someone leaning on a railing beside you without touching you. There is a mood to the lattice, now a sense of collective anticipation that no one has named, because naming is cumbersome here, but you can taste it in the shared quiet, the way the threads hold their positions, just a fraction tighter than before. The bending of space outside grows more noticeable. Corners appear where there should be none, not visual corners, but bends in direction itself, and in those angles, you see flickers of shapes that might be other vessels, or might be reflections of this one, or might be the kind of hallucination you get when the place you occupy decides to remember. It is moving. One of the flickers lingers a fraction too long, and you realize it is looking back at you, not with eyes, because eyes are a local convenience of certain worlds, but with a kind of attention that feels heavier than the hum. It measures you, as if deciding whether you are still part of the lattice, or a loose piece worth discarding. The moment passes, but the weight of it does not. You wonder what happens to threads that are removed, and immediately regret the question, because the hum dips into a note that feels like the absence of breath, and the Surroundings blur for a heartbeat before steadying again. You realize the glide is no longer slow, though it still pretends to be the same way a river pretends to be still, while carrying entire forests downstream. The bending angles multiply, and the flickers grow sharper sometimes. They overlap with the weave for an instant before vanishing, as if the lattice is passing too close to something else, and reality is getting sloppy about keeping the boundaries neat. The other threads do not speak, but their silence has a texture to it now, as if everyone is listening for the same signal without knowing when or from where it will come. The hum tightens, then swells, and with it comes a thin high note, almost too faint to notice, that seems to mark the beginning of whatever the lattice has been preparing for since the moment you arrived. The thin high note holds for longer than is reasonable, and you start to suspect that it is less a sound and more an unbroken line being drawn across everything, a kind of cosmic underline, as if the lattice wants to make sure whatever comes next is highlighted for later reference, though you are not sure who would be reading it in the first place. The weave responds in ways you can only describe as polite agitation, the threads adjusting their angles, minutely shifting in and out of alignment, like a room full of people straightening their backs at the same time. The flickers that had been politely minding their business now seem to be less interested in staying at a distance. One appears just long enough for you to notice that its shape is not actually a shape at all, but a deliberate absence of one, a hole in the idea of form that seems to carry its own momentum. And then another appears closer, overlapping the edge of the lattice without asking permission, and leaving behind a faint smell you cannot identify, but are sure you would never want to smell again. Under ordinary circumstances, the high note wavers once in what feels like approval or warning, or both. The threads around you tighten again, not in fear exactly, but in the way one might prepare for a guest who may or may not eat the furniture. The bending of the space around you becomes more structured now, like a series of nested loops, each one folding over the last with mechanical patience. The loops reveal glimpses of places that seem almost familiar and almost wrong, a street with no shadows, a river flowing uphill with no urgency, a sky holding three suns that all seem to be arguing with one another in slow motion. You realize these are not destinations, but rehearsals, possibilities the lattice is considering before deciding where to deposit you. The high note bends downward into something richer, a resonance that seems to come from inside your own skull, and with it comes the faint sensation that the lattice is aware of your awareness, which is not inherently threatening, but is never entirely comfortable either. More absences drift into view, some hovering at the periphery, and some brushing past in ways that make the weave ripple the way water does when something unseen passes. Just beneath the surface, you have the distinct impression that the absences are not here for you, but are not opposed to taking you along if you happen to be in the right position. When they move, the loops begin to close in faster, now compressing the options. The flickers become fewer but sharper, each one seeming to watch the others as though they are in competition for something you cannot define. Then, without any ceremony, the loops collapse into a single fold, so deep you cannot see either end, and the lattice moves into it with the same casual certainty of a hand slipping into a pocket. The sensation is less like falling and more like being poured out of something you did not realize you were inside until it decided you should no longer be there, and the fold stretches you in every possible direction without ever actually touching you, which is impressive in the same way that balancing a full cup of tea on a running cat would be impressive, except the stakes feel significantly less domestic and more whatever the opposite of domestic is. The lattice threads hum faintly as they glide past, and you notice that some are fraying slightly at the edges, little curls of nothingness peeling away as if they have been doing this For far longer than any responsible structure ought to be doing anything, the absent shapes are still around, though they seem to have lost interest in you and are now engaged in some slow drifting exchange of positions that resembles a dance, if the dance were choreographed by someone who had only read about movement in a book and never actually seen it. The fold narrows without warning until it is a ribbon and then a hair, and then something thinner than anything that can be said to exist, and yet somehow you remain intact as you slide through it, like a grain of thought being filed away in an archive no one will ever read. The space on the other side is startling in its ordinariness. A field of pale grass under a sky that cannot seem to decide whether it wants to be morning or evening, the light coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air smells faintly metallic, as though the wind has been collecting spare change from somewhere else. You take a tentative step, and the grass bends without breaking, each blade reflecting a slightly different scene than the one you are standing in, as though the ground has opinions about reality and is unwilling to commit to just one in the distance. There is what might be a tree, though the closer you look, the less certain you become. Its trunk seems to be made of coiled threads that shimmer like the lattice, but move with a lazy rhythm, all their own. The branches split into more branches, which split again, until they dissolve into points of light that drift away like bored fireflies. The fold behind you snaps shut without a sound, and you realize that whatever this place is, it has decided. You are staying for a while. The thought does not fill you with dread exactly, but it does bring the quiet recognition that you have once again been moved into a situation with no clear exits and no clear instructions, and perhaps no clear purpose, unless the purpose is simply to watch and wait and see whether the grass, the sky, and the coiled tree are part of the same thought, or three entirely separate ones that have been awkwardly introduced at a party neither wanted to attend. You stand there for what could be seconds or centuries, because time here feels like a mildly disinterested host who occasionally wanders by to see if you are still alive before drifting off to rearrange the furniture of the universe elsewhere. And the grass continues its quiet, shimmering disagreement with itself about what should be reflected in its blades, some showing places you recognize, others showing events you are certain never happened, but could have if the right person had sneezed at the right moment. You decide to walk toward the coiled tree because it seems like the sort of thing one does when given no instructions, and because it might be rude not to. The threads making up its trunk appear to adjust themselves slightly as you approach, not moving exactly, but altering their arrangement the way people in a crowded elevator subtly shift to pretend they have more personal space than they do up. Close. The tree emits a low hum that you do not so much hear as feel in your teeth. It is not unpleasant, but it does make you aware of how many teeth you have, and you begin to suspect. The tree is not a tree in any conventional sense, rather it is some kind of knot that has been tied in whatever passes for reality here, and the branches are simply the frayed ends of that knot, drifting lazily into elsewhere. You reach out to touch one of the shimmering coils, and it recoils slightly as if startled, then relaxes and lets you rest your fingers against it. The sensation is both soft and impossibly dense, like stroking the surface of a cloud that has decided it will no longer tolerate being insubstantial. A faint pulse travels down the coil into the trunk and then into the ground, and you notice the grass around you shift its reflections, so they are all showing the same image, a vast expanse of water under a sky that is much too close, the surface of the water perfectly still, except for one point far in the distance, where something is rising slowly, as if reluctant to disturb its own drama. You take this as a hint that you are supposed to go there, though whether it is the tree or the ground or the reflections giving The hint is unclear. You begin walking in the direction indicated and find that the field slopes gradually downward until the pale grass gives way to a shore made, not of sand, but of something that looks like finely ground glass. It crunches softly under your steps and leaves no footprints, which you find both polite and vaguely suspicious. The water is so clear you can see straight down to the bottom, which is covered in smooth black stones that seem to hum faintly in harmony with the coil tree behind you. Far out on the water, the rising shape is clearer. Now it is not an island as you first thought, but a massive geometric structure, like a pyramid that has been turned inside out. Its surfaces folding inward and outward in slow, impossible movements. It appears to be approaching, though you realize after a moment it is not moving toward you at all, rather the water between you, and it is vanishing in a way that brings it closer without it having to move. This strikes you as the sort of thing that should be alarming, but the calm, clever part of your mind reminds you that nothing here seems inclined to hurry, least of all danger. So you simply stand at the edge of the glass shore and wait to see whether the approaching shape intends to greet you, devour you, or simply continue unfolding itself for its own amusement. The shape does not so much arrive as allow you to notice that it has always been here, which feels like a slightly smug trick on its part, and you cannot help but suspect it is the sort of structure that takes pride in the fact that it does not require conventional introductions. It stands before you, vast and quiet, its folding surfaces moving with the unhurried precision of someone who knows they have all the time in the world and no particular need to explain themselves. The glass shore beneath your feet vibrates faintly in sync with its movements, sending tiny ripples through the air rather than the water, which is now gone, entirely replaced by a kind of stillness so complete you can almost hear the absence of sound as a tangible thing. The pyramid, or whatever it prefers to be called, leans forward. If such a concept applies to shapes that do not actually possess a front or back, and you find yourself being drawn not physically but mentally into its interior, where the folding surfaces now form corridors that stretch on forever, each lined with shelves, filled with objects that are almost but not quite recognizable. There is a cup that appears to be made from condensed laughter, a mirror that reflects who you might have been if you had taken that one impulsive trip years ago, and a small clock whose hands do not move but whose numbers shift when you are not looking. You pick up a sphere the size of a plum which pulses gently in your palm, and when you hold it up to your ear, you hear a faint conversation between two voices, speaking in a language you are certain does not exist outside this moment. One voice is calm and deliberate, the other quick and uncertain, yet both seem to be arguing about whether you are real. The shelves continue deeper, and you follow them, partly because the path forward is more interesting than the thought of turning back, and partly because you are aware that in this place, turning back is probably just another form of going forward. After what feels like both minutes and centuries, you come to a room, or perhaps a concept of a room, in which the shelves give way to a wide open space, filled with what looks like falling snow, except the flakes drift upward, each one carrying within it a tiny moving scene. You reach for one, and it bursts softly against your hand, releasing a smell that reminds you of the first time you realized you were being lied to in a way that was almost kind. The pyramid watches you, though not with eyes, more with an ambient awareness that makes you think of the way a cat observes a bird from across the garden, pretending it is not interested. You have the impression it is offering you something, though what exactly is being offered is left unspoken. It could be knowledge, or escape, or perhaps simply the chance to keep wandering among its impossible corridors forever, without needing to decide, and you realize, with a strange calm, that you might actually take it. You Do not answer the offer, because answering would imply you fully understand the question. And you have the creeping suspicion that the question itself might be a moving target that changes shape the moment you think you have grasped it. So instead, you walk further into the pyramid, which is no longer a pyramid at all, but a long hallway paved with shifting tiles, each tile displaying a small looping memory, some yours, some belonging to people you have never met, and some apparently belonging to objects that should not even be capable of having memories. A spoon remembering the heat of 1,000 soups, a stone recalling the day it fell into the river, and a book that seems to fondly relive the moment it was slammed shut mid-sentence. You step carefully between these flickering recollections until the hallway bends slightly to the left, or perhaps the hallway stays still and the concept of left simply repositions itself around you, and here you find a series of chairs, each one occupied by a version of yourself. You do not recognize. One wears a suit and looks impatient, another wears clothes from a century you have not lived through and drums their fingers on the armrest, and a third version wears nothing at all except an expression of having been told an inconvenient truth. These other selves glance at you in turn, some nod, some smirk, some do not acknowledge you at all, and you get the uneasy impression that they know something you do not, yet they have no intention of telling you. And perhaps they are even betting against you finding it out. The hallway widens into a kind of courtyard under a sky that is both daylight and night at the same time, with a sun and moon circling each other lazily like cats, pretending to be indifferent. And here there is a fountain, but instead of water it flows with faint music, the kind that almost makes you remember a dream you once had about a train that could not decide where to stop. The music seems to be humming in the same key as your own heartbeat, and for a moment you are unsure whether you are breathing to match it or it is pulsing to match you. You approach the fountain and see that the surface of the music is rippling in response to thoughts you have not yet had, which feels intrusive but in a polite sort of way. From here, a staircase spirals upward, though it is unclear if it leads up or simply around, and as you place your foot on the first step, you notice the pyramid, or perhaps the absence of it, watching from every direction at once, as if mildly curious about whether you will make the same mistakes as before. Even though you cannot remember making them, you climb the stairs, which occasionally skip numbers or repeat them without warning, until you arrive at a platform suspended in what appears to be a vast library, except the books are made entirely of keys, and each key unlocks something you have already lost. You take one at random and find yourself holding a door handle to a door that no longer exists, and as you turn it, the air changes and a faint scent of rain on stone drifts past you, pulling you into another corridor that may in fact be the same one you began in, though now the shelves are gone and the floor is covered in a soft moss that feels like it is remembering being a forest in another lifetime. Ahead you see a dim light and realize it is not a lamp or a torch, but the glow of your own curiosity wandering ahead of you, impatient to see what comes next. You follow your curiosity as it drifts ahead, like a lantern without a hand to hold it, and you realize it is moving slightly faster than you would prefer, as though it suspects you might try to stop it, and is not willing to negotiate, and the moss under your feet grows thicker until it muffles even the sound of your own thoughts, which is disconcerting because you had not realized thoughts could make a sound until they stopped doing so. And now in the silence, you notice that the corridor is no longer made of stone, but of something softer that yields a little when you touch it, and has the faint warmth of something that remembers being alive. The walls pulse in a slow rhythm like a deep, steady breath, and you wonder if you have wandered not into a building, but into some vast, patient creature that has allowed you in, either as a guest or as a future meal. The light ahead shifts color from a pale curiosity glow to something more like the shade of an almost forgotten memory of fire, and the air carries the faint smell of old paper and new rain and something faintly metallic. You round a corner that may not be a corner at all and find yourself in what seems to be a market, but instead of stalls selling food or goods, each vendor appears to be offering fragments of time, a jar of 3 minutes from an afternoon in late autumn, a small box containing the exact instant someone realized they had left the stove on, and a bowl in which floats the heavy, slow minute before bad news arrives. Each vendor watches you with mild interest, as though sizing up whether you are a collector or merely browsing. One offers you a coin with 2 sides, both marked yesterday, and another tries to trade you a sack of silence for whatever it is you are carrying in your pocket, even though you are quite sure your pockets are empty. You decline politely and keep moving, and the market gradually fades into a forest where the trees are so tall their tops are lost in a mist that seems to have been imported from somewhere else entirely. The trunks are carved with messages in a language that looks vaguely familiar, like handwriting from a dream, and when you place your palm against one of the carvings, you hear a voice in your mind saying something about the importance of remembering where you put your other self, which you choose not to think about too much. A narrow path winds between the trees and leads to a clearing where a single chair sits in the middle, as though expecting someone, and on the chair rests a small sealed envelope with your name written in ink that appears fresh. You pick it up and feel it vibrating faintly, as if the words inside are rehearsing themselves before they are read. You are tempted to open it, but instead, you slip it into your coat, not because you fear what it might say, but because you suspect it will open itself when it is ready, and forcing it would be impolite. From the clearing, several paths branch off in directions that do not correspond to anything as simple as north or south, and you take the one that seems to hum faintly under your feet, as if pleased with your choice. The trees here grow stranger, their branches forming shapes that remind you of gestures people make when they are about to say something important, but then think better of it. The air becomes warmer, and you realize you can see faint ripples in it, like heat rising from a road, though here they seem to move sideways at a deliberate pace, and just as you are wondering where they lead, your curiosity drifts into one of them and disappears without a sound, leaving you momentarily alone with nothing but the envelope in your pocket and the faint echo of footsteps that may not be your own. You stand very still, because the footsteps that may not be your own have politely stopped just far enough away to let you notice them without confirming their existence, which feels like a social game you did not agree to play yet here. You are a reluctant contestant in an unspoken competition of who will blink first, except there is no visible opponent, and blinking does not seem to be the metric, so you take one step forward, and the sound takes one step back, maintaining the sort of courteous distance one keeps when walking behind a stranger who might stop suddenly. The envelope in your pocket twitches as though impatient at your lack of progress, and you have the peculiar sensation that it might be writing something new inside itself, so you reach in and take it out, only to find that it is slightly heavier than before, and now faintly warm, as if whatever message it contains has just been baked to perfection by some unseen kitchen staff. You are considering opening it when the ground beneath you tilts ever so slightly, not enough to knock you over, but enough to remind you that gravity is more of a casual arrangement than a strict contract in this place. The sideways ripples in the air grow thicker and start to resemble translucent curtains swaying in a breeze you cannot feel, and without quite deciding to, you step through one and find yourself on a long, narrow bridge that appears to stretch between two moments, rather than two locations. The planks are carved with dates, some familiar, some impossibly far in either direction, and when you step on one, you get the faintest flash of something that may be a memory, but not necessarily your own. A voice from nowhere warns you not to linger on the wrong year, but does not specify which years those are, so you decide to keep moving at a pace that suggests both confidence and mild urgency. Halfway across the bridge, you notice a man sitting cross-legged in the middle, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of something that keeps changing form whenever you try to identify it. He glances up, nods in the universal manner of strangers acknowledging each other without committing to conversation, and then says, without preamble, that the bridge is only as long as you make it, which is either helpful advice or deeply unhelpful, depending on how seriously you take him. You choose to interpret it as an encouragement to walk faster, which you do, until the far end comes into view, and there, instead of solid ground, there is what looks like the surface of a pond, reflecting a sky that does not match the one above. You stepping onto it feels like walking on memory foam that sighs faintly with each footfall, and the reflection ripples not from your steps, but from something moving beneath it, a shape that seems to be pacing you just out of sight. The envelope in your hand twitches again, and you finally open it only to find a single sentence written in impossibly neat handwriting. It says, "You will know when to stop," and you are still frowning at the ambiguity when the pond surface suddenly gives way, dropping you into what at first feels like cold water, but quickly turns into something more like liquid glass. You sink slowly, able to breathe, though the air tastes faintly of old keys and unread books, and below you the shape that had been pacing now comes into view. It is not a creature exactly, but more like an outline of where a creature could be. If someone remembered it hard enough, it passes beneath you without looking up, and you realize with relief or disappointment that it does not care about you in the slightest. You drift down until your feet touch something solid and find yourself in a vast library whose shelves are arranged in spirals that twist in on themselves like seashells. The books here are all blank on the outside, with no titles, but each gives off a subtle hum that suggests its contents are very much alive. You walk between them, and one book falls off the shelf in front of you, landing open on the floor. The pages are covered in handwriting that looks suspiciously like your own, though you have no memory of writing it. The first line reads, "This is where you will wait until the footsteps catch up," and you are still wondering whether that is a command or a warning when you hear that same polite, measured tread echoing from somewhere deep in the spiral. You stand perfectly still in the spiral library, listening to the footsteps draw nearer, not in a hurried way, but in that maddeningly casual pace of someone who knows you cannot leave without passing them. And as the sound bounces off the curved shelves, it becomes hard to tell whether they are behind you, ahead of you, or politely orbiting your position. Like a shy moon, unsure whether to commit to collision, you pick up the book that had fallen open, and notice that the handwriting now moves across the page, rearranging itself in real time, as if deciding which story it wants to tell, and you are only vaguely aware that the words seem to shift, depending on whether you read them aloud or silently. In your head, you decide to read one line aloud, and it comes out in a voice that is not yours, a voice that sounds older than the library itself, and perhaps slightly irritated at having been disturbed. The line says, "Walk until you forget which direction you were going, and then keep going." And since that is not exactly a plan, but also not exactly bad advice, you begin walking deeper into the spiral. The shelves grow taller, the hum of the books louder, and you pass a section where the air feels thicker, as though each step must push through syrup made of old sentences. A small wooden ladder leans against a shelf that disappears into the gloom above, and you briefly consider climbing it, but then notice that the rungs are engraved with names you do not recognize, except one that is unmistakably yours, yet spelled incorrectly in a way that makes you uneasy. You keep walking until you arrive at a table in the middle of an open alcove, where a single candle burns with a flame that does not flicker, and beside it sits a cup of something steaming, though it smells like a memory you cannot quite place. You take a sip without thinking, and it tastes like the exact day you realized you had forgotten something important, though the thing itself remains stubbornly hidden from your mind. As you set the cup down, the footsteps stop, and for a moment, the silence feels heavy enough to bend the floor. The candlelight shifts slightly, and you notice a tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of the alcove, face obscured by a hood that seems to absorb rather than cast shadows. They raise one hand and point not at you, but at the book still in your other hand, and when you glance down, the pages have gone completely blank, except for a small ink mark shaped like a doorway. You look up to ask a question, but the figure is already gone, leaving only the faint smell of rain on stone. You turn the page and find another doorway symbol, then another, each one subtly different, as if offering multiple exits or entrances. You choose one at random, and without thinking press your hand to the paper. It gives way like warm wax, and suddenly you are stepping through into a corridor lined with windows, showing not the outside world but scenes from various points in your life. Some you recognize, some you absolutely do not, and some you are fairly certain have not happened. Yet each scene changes the longer you look at it, as though unwilling to be pinned down to a single version of events. You walk past them, resisting the temptation to linger, though one window catches your eye because it shows you standing exactly where you are now, watching yourself through the glass. You move on, and the corridor gradually slopes downward until the floor becomes a narrow walkway over a vast expanse of dark water. The sound of distant machinery hums somewhere below, and you realize, with a strange calm, that the footsteps have started again, though this time they are above you. Tracing the walkway narrows until it feels less like a bridge and more like the spine of some impossibly large creature that has politely agreed to hold still while you cross, though you cannot shake the feeling that at any moment it might decide to shift its weight and send you tumbling into the dark water below. The hum of machinery grows louder, and occasionally you catch sight of a faint glow far beneath the surface, as if something is moving there, something vast and unbothered by your presence. The footsteps above remain steady, not hurried, not slow, just patient, in that unnerving way of someone who knows there is nowhere for you to go, that they cannot eventually follow you. Find yourself wondering if the ceiling walker is merely mirroring your steps, or if you are both moving toward some predetermined convergence point. You glance up, hoping for a glimpse, but the ceiling remains shrouded in shadow and distance. Then, without warning, the walkway widens into a platform where a small brass bench sits facing what can only be described as a door made of fog. It swirls lazily, never dissipating, and when you step closer, you see faint shapes drifting inside the mist, almost like silhouettes of people, but they seem to be standing still, as if waiting for you, or ignoring you entirely. You sit on the bench, mostly because it seems like the sort of place where one sits before doing something inadvisable. The bench is surprisingly warm, and the metal hums faintly, like it is sharing a secret you cannot quite hear. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment, and in that brief stillness, the footsteps above finally stop. You open your eyes to find the fog door much closer than it had been, as though it has decided to approach you rather than wait for you to approach it. You consider the possibility that perhaps you have been still too long, and the world has decided to take matters into its own hands. You stand and place one hand into the mist, half expecting it to be cold, but it feels like the air in a room where someone has just told a joke that no one wanted to acknowledge. You step through and find yourself in a place that could be called a room only in the loosest sense. It has walls, but they are made of shelves filled with jars of light. Each jar glows at a different intensity, and some flicker like candle flames while others shine steadily. You pick one at random and hold it up to your ear because it feels like the sort of thing one does here, and you hear a distant sound like waves on a shore you have never visited. You put it back and take another jar. This one plays, the sound of voices speaking in a language you do not know, yet somehow understand. Enough to know they are arguing about whether or not the moon should be considered an accessory or a necessity. You keep moving through the shelves, noticing that the jars are arranged in no discernible order. Some are labeled with single words, others with long sentences, and some with nothing at all. You reach a shelf where one jar is much larger than the others, and instead of light, it contains what looks like a fragment of the night sky. You stare into it long enough to feel slightly dizzy, and when you look away, the footsteps have returned, but now they are not above you, they are behind you, very close. You turn, expecting to see the hooded figure again, but instead, there is a tall mirror where you would have sworn empty space had been. It reflects you accurately enough, except your reflection is holding a jar you have not yet touched, and as you watch it lifts the lid and releases a small luminous shape that floats upward into the darkness above the shelves. You turn to see where it went, but the ceiling is gone, replaced by an expanse of stars that feel uncomfortably near. You look back at the mirror, and your reflection is gone, leaving only the faint outline of a doorway where the glass had been. You step through, because the alternative seems to be waiting here until the jars run out of light, and as you do, the footsteps resume, only now they seem to be walking in perfect time with yours, as though whatever has been following you is finally content to walk beside you, even if you cannot see it. The space beyond the doorway is neither room nor corridor, but something more like a thought someone once had about what a hallway should be. The floor is flat enough to walk on, though it appears to be made of slow-moving ink that parts slightly under each step, and then lazily flows back together, as if reluctant to let you go. The walls, if they can be called that, ripple faintly like curtains in a breeze you cannot feel, and the air carries the faint, metallic taste of a memory you have not yet made. The footsteps that had been beside you are still there, perfectly matched, as though you and this unseen companion have finally agreed on the same pace, which would be comforting if it were not so. Entirely without explanation, you try glancing sideways in the hope of catching some peripheral glimpse, but your gaze slips as though the edges of your vision are being politely turned away from the truth ahead. The hallway curves gently upward, in a way that suggests it might eventually fold back on itself, but before you can test the theory, you notice a series of tall, narrow alcoves, each holding a single object illuminated by a small hanging lantern. The first contains a pair of gloves, stitched from something that might be leather, or might be the skin of a word peeled from a sentence. The second holds a small brass key, whose teeth are shaped like the silhouettes of birds in mid-flight. The third is more unsettling, a mask that appears to be carved from your own face, though with an expression you do not remember ever making. You do not touch any of them, mostly because you suspect they would touch back. The hallway curves again, and the alcoves give way to windows, except the windows do not look outside, they look in. Each one reveals a different room, furnished and inhabited, but always without doors or visible entrances in one. A man sits at a desk, slowly writing in a book that bursts into quiet flame as soon as the words appear. In another, a woman waters a single plant, whose leaves are made entirely of folded paper cranes. In a third, a child builds an elaborate structure from dominoes, each piece painted with a tiny portrait of the same sleeping figure. You keep moving, resisting the urge to tap on the glass, for fear of what might tap back eventually. The windows end and the ink floor solidifies into something like polished stone, though it still seems to shift slightly if you look directly at it. The footsteps beside you pause for the first time, and in that sudden silence you hear a faint hum ahead. It grows louder as you approach until you find its source, a great circular opening in the floor surrounded by an ornate railing carved with repeating patterns of eyes, all half-lidded, as if pretending not to watch you peer over the edge and see what appears to be an ocean far below. But the waves move in slow, deliberate spirals, converging on a single point that glows faintly gold. You are certain this is important in the way things in dreams are important, without offering any reason why you consider climbing down, but the railing shifts under your hands as though it would rather you not. And in that moment, the footsteps return, but now they sound heavier, slower, and when you turn, there is finally something there, a figure tall and thin, dressed in garments that seem stitched from scraps of maps, all showing places you have never been. Its face is obscured, not by a hood but by a curtain of fine silver chains that sway gently even without wind. It raises one hand in a gesture that could be greeting or warning, and then, without a word, turns and begins walking back the way you came, pausing only to glance over its shoulder as though expecting you to follow. You hesitate, glancing once more into the golden spiral far below, before deciding that perhaps for now it is better to follow the chain-faced stranger, if only to see where they think you ought to be going. And so you find yourself standing in that faintly familiar place, where the road fades into a quiet nothing, and the air feels as if it has been holding its breath for centuries. The sound of your own footsteps softening until they are no more, and in that stillness, you notice the figure who had once walked just ahead of you, now pausing, turning ever so slightly to meet your gaze, with the kind of look that says without words that this was as far as the journey was meant to go. There is no grand revelation, no thundering climax, only the subtle comfort of knowing that all the oddities, the long silences, the unanswered questions were simply part of the way here. The horizon does not end, it only dissolves, and you feel the weight in your chest become lighter, as if it too has decided to rest. The night folds around you gently, and without ceremony the story closes its eyes, and so should you. Good night.